"Man, it feels good to be home," Rick Anderson muttered as he pulled into the driveway, gripping the steering wheel like he needed to steady himself. Just saying the words out loud felt cathartic. He sat there for a moment, letting the quiet hum of his car's engine fill the space around him. It was Friday night, his first real chance in days to breathe. Not just a quick stop to grab a few restless hours of sleep before another grueling workday. No, tonight was different. Tonight, he was home. The week had drained him. 60 hours of relentless work, crisis after crisis at the marketing firm, deadlines that weren't supposed to be his problem but somehow landed on his shoulders anyway. 2 employees quit on Monday without warning, leaving him scrambling to cover their workloads. Wednesday, one of his best analysts shattered her ankle in a freak accident. And today, just 2 hours ago, he had finally turned in a project that should never have demanded so much of him. It wasn't supposed to be like this. If everything had gone as planned, he would have been home early. He would have surprised Adriana at work, taken her out for lunch, maybe spent the afternoon tangled up with her before their usual date night. Instead, he had barely spoken to her in the past 36 hours, their conversations reduced to quick texts and tired apologies. His jaw tightened at the thought. Adriana had been understanding, she always was, but that didn't make him feel any less guilty. She didn't deserve to come second to his job. "I need to make it up to her," he murmured, rubbing the back of his neck. And for all I know, that might take all weekend. But that wasn't a complaint. If anything, he welcomed the challenge. Rick exhaled and reached for the door handle, but then he noticed something. A small folded note was taped to the doorknob. His name was scrawled across the front in Adriana's handwriting. Rick's brow creased slightly as he pulled it free, his fingers tracing the familiar script. With a quick flick, he unfolded the paper and read the words inside. "Welcome home. I know you've had a hard week. Open the door to make it better." His pulse kicked up a notch. She always had a way of surprising him, of pulling him out of his thoughts at just the right moment. But this was different. His fingers tightened around the note as a slow, intrigued smirk formed on his lips. With renewed energy, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. And then, his breath caught. The house was dimly lit, the usual warm glow of the living room lamp replaced by the flickering ambience of a few scattered candles. The soft scent of vanilla and something else, something undeniably Adriana, lingered in the air. But what truly stole his breath was the sight of her. She was waiting for him in the narrow hallway, right between the staircase and the small wooden table where he usually tossed his keys. Only this time, she wasn't dressed in one of her casual oversized shirts or leggings. She wasn't dressed at all. Rick blinked, his brain short-circuiting for a moment. Adriana sat on the wooden floor, her long, toned legs stretched out in front of her, the warm candlelight dancing over the curves of her bare skin. Her dark, wavy hair cascaded over one shoulder, her deep brown eyes locking onto his with an expression that was equal parts playful and sultry. "Took you long enough," she teased, tilting her head slightly. Rick's fingers flexed at his sides, his grip tightening on the note still in his hand. Adriana had never been shy about her desires, but this was something else entirely. There was an intent behind her posture, the way she leaned back on her hands, completely comfortable in her own skin, making no effort to cover herself. She knew exactly what she was doing to him. "Jesus, Adriana," he breathed, raking a hand through his already disheveled hair. "You really don't do subtle, do you?" She grinned. "You've been working too hard. I figured you needed a reminder of what's waiting for you when you finally slow down." Rick let out a low chuckle, his exhaustion fading into something else, something deeper. Whatever the week had taken from him, Adriana was already giving back. And tonight, he had no intention of letting anything else take his time away from her. Dropping the note onto the table, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Message received," he murmured. And just like that, the week faded into the background. His pulse thundered in his ears. The exhaustion weighing him down all week suddenly felt like a distant memory. Adriana reached out, beckoning him with a slow curl of her fingers. "So, Are you just going to stand there all night? Or are you going to come home properly? Rick let out a breath that was half laugh, half exhale as he took a step forward, kicking the door shut behind him. The familiar sound of the lock clicking into place echoed in the quiet house, sealing them into the private world she had so carefully created. Adriana's eyes darkened slightly as he moved closer, her gaze flickering over him, the rumpled button-down, the loosened tie, the way his shoulders still carried the tension of the week. She knew him well enough to recognize when he was holding on to stress, and she clearly had no intention of letting it linger tonight. "You're unbelievable," he murmured, dropping his keys onto the table without even looking. "You love it." He did. More than he could ever put into words. Kneeling down, he reached for her, his fingers tracing along the smooth skin of her arm before cupping her cheek. Adriana leaned into the touch, her lashes fluttering slightly as she exhaled. "I missed you," he admitted softly. "I know I've been." She pressed a finger to his lips, silencing him with a shake of her head. "I know. You don't have to say it." Rick swallowed hard, his thumb brushing over the corner of her mouth. She had always been patient with him, always understood the demands of his job even when they frustrated her. But this wasn't just about patience. It was about something deeper, something unspoken but understood between them. A promise. A reminder. A homecoming in every sense of the word. Adriana's fingers trailed down his chest, to the buttons of his shirt. "Let me help you forget this week ever happened." Rick exhaled sharply, the last remnants of stress dissolving as he finally gave in. And just like that, he was home. Rick swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as he took in the sight of his wife sprawled so shamelessly before him. The soft glow of candlelight flickered against her skin, casting warm shadows that only emphasized the curves he had once traced with such reverence. "Welcome home, babe," Adriana greeted, her voice smooth, sultry. "I had a feeling you'd need something like this." Rick exhaled sharply, gripping the back of his neck as he tried, and failed, to process what was happening. "Adriana," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "I'm not sure what's going on here." She chuckled, the sound rich and inviting. "Rick, it's exactly what you think it is, and then some," she teased, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Now, are you going to stand there and gawk, or are you going to get in here and let me welcome you?" His mouth opened, then shut. His brain had stalled, caught between rationality and sheer, raw desire. But even as confusion lingered, the primal part of him had already taken notice. It had been too long, far too long, since he had last touched her. The past 2 weeks had been a blur of late nights, exhaustion, and quiet frustration. Now, standing in the doorway with Adriana laid bare before him, all of that pent-up tension came rushing back, surging through his veins like a live wire. 2 weeks. That was the longest they had gone without sex since they both got hit with the flu 3 years ago. Unacceptable. His fingers twitched at his sides, his pulse hammering in his ears as his gaze raked over her body, her smooth skin, the slight arch of her back, the teasing way she kept her legs just far enough apart to drive him crazy. She was testing him, daring him to make the first move. Rick closed the door, twisting the lock with a decisive click. "Adriana," he began, still struggling to find his voice. "What exactly brought this on?" She tilted her head, amusement dancing in her expression. "Do I really need a reason?" Rick huffed out a laugh, raking a hand through his hair. "I mean, a little warning would have been nice. Maybe a text that said, 'Hey, babe, be prepared to have your mind blown when you get home.'" Adriana smirked. "Where's the fun in that?" He let out another breath, shaking his head. God, he had missed her. The playfulness, the intimacy, the unspoken understanding between them that had always come so effortlessly. And yet, beneath all that teasing, he saw something more. A flicker of need, of deep, unyielding hunger. Not just for sex for him. That realization struck something deep inside him. "You were waiting for me," he murmured, his voice lower now, rougher. Adriana's smirk softened into something more sincere. "Always." That single word unraveled what little restraint he had left. In 2 strides, he was on her. He dropped to his knees, hands sliding over her thighs as he captured her lips in a kiss that was long, slow, and starving. Adriana responded instantly, her fingers tangling in his shirt, pulling him closer, as if trying to merge them into one. Rick groaned against her mouth, his grip tightening. She was warm, so warm, and the way her body molded against his made him curse himself for ever letting work keep them apart. Her hands slid lower, fumbling with the buttons of his shirt, but he beat her to it, yanking the fabric over his head and tossing it aside. The second it was gone, she ran her nails down his chest, making him shudder. "God, I missed you," she whispered. Rick exhaled sharply, resting his forehead against hers. "Then let's make up for lost time." And just like that, the world outside ceased to exist. Rick let out a breathy chuckle, still trying to process just how his wife had turned a stressful, soul-crushing week into this. He ran a hand over his face, shaking his head as he looked at her, really looked at her. Adriana wasn't just waiting for him, she had planned this. And damn if he wasn't grateful for it. "Before you begin," she said, cutting him off before he could find the right words, "let me just make a few things clear. It should explain why I decided to ditch dinner, candles, and clothes for the night." Rick arched a brow. "That would be helpful," he replied, a half-grin creeping onto his face. Adriana's expression softened, though there was a knowing glint in her eye. "For the record, I know how busy you were this past week. Believe it or not, I do listen when you tell me about your day," she said. "You're not one to complain, but you do tend to wall yourself off. It's how you keep your mood from affecting the people you care about." Rick's grin widened. On top of how incredible she looked, Adriana was also reminding him just how well she knew him. They had been together long enough that she had picked up on his habits, the little things he'd barely noticed about himself. Not a lot of men could say that about their wives. It was another reminder of just how lucky he was. "I'm not going to lie. That does bother me to some extent," Adriana admitted, tilting her head slightly. Rick sighed, nodding. "And I'd planned on spending the weekend apologizing for that." But she shook her head before he could say anything else. "Save it. You've got nothing to be sorry for." "I've already accepted that harping on that is pointless," she said simply. "Your job is important. Sometimes a lot of shit goes wrong. Rather than agonize over it, I say we skip to the part where we just celebrate that it's over." Rick blinked, momentarily thrown by how effortlessly she had stripped away the guilt he'd been carrying all week. "Celebrate," he echoed, his voice trailing off as his gaze flickered down her body again. Adriana smirked. "Yeah, celebrate." He exhaled sharply, suddenly feeling like a teenager who had just stumbled onto something forbidden. She snickered at his dazed expression, and he found himself laughing too. By every measure, this was crazy, like something ripped straight out of a bad porno. And yet, it also made a twisted sort of sense. Rick took a step closer, his fingers flexing at his sides as he let himself really take her in. Her hair was slightly tousled, her skin practically glowing under the dim light. She was comfortable, confident, and completely at ease, just waiting for him to catch up. His entire body, which had been heavy with exhaustion just moments ago, suddenly felt lighter. The tension in his shoulders, the dull headache from staring at screens all day, the mental fog that came with back-to-back meetings, it all seemed to melt away as he stood before her. "You really planned all this out, huh?" he mused, voice lower now. Adriana shrugged, her smirk deepening. "You had your week of planning. I had tonight." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "I should have known you'd do something like this."